Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Boylan. Just in terms of announcements, we've had a number of episodes so far, and I'm really happy with the positive feedback, including the 2.5-hour nerd fest between myself and Jennifer Roche on Anglicanism. I never knew it would be that popular. If you wish to appear on an episode or you wish to submit any questions to any forthcoming guests, you can do so at scripturalmormonism@gmail.com. I'm going to keep the introduction very brief here today because we're going to be dealing with a very hot button topic that in the past few days has actually become all the more heated, shall we say. But before we do, let's actually have our guest introduce himself. Our guest today is my friend Tarik LaCour. Tarik, thanks for agreeing to come onto the podcast today. And for those who may not know too much about you and may not ever have heard of you before, how about you give us a brief introduction to who you're and what you do?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. My name is Tarik LaCour. I am a PhD student in philosophy and in psychology at Texas A&M University here in College Station, Texas. I am a convert to the church. I've been a member of the church for 12 years in September, and I have a blog. It's called The Scientistic Stance, and that's about all.
And I hope Tarik will be a frequent guest on this. We hope to have him again in the near future to discuss his proposed solution to the mind-body problem. And maybe myself, Blake Oster, and himself, Tarik can come on and discuss our different views about God and foreknowledge. I think Tarik's wrong. He thinks I'm wrong. So, but he has the libertarian free will to disagree with me.
Yeah, I think your first episode was on open theism, which is a big component of that is libertarian free will and determinism being false. Both of which I think are wrong because I think God does have foreknowledge and determinism is true. So when you think about it,
it would be a good roundtable discussion to have in the near future.
It'll be a great show. But let's get to the.
But no, today's topic is a very controversial topic, and let me just note that we actually had plans to discuss this before the recent Brad Wilcox furore, shall we say. So it's only coincidental that we're discussing it this week. It was actually in the pipeline, but all the more important that we actually do discuss it today because it's going to be in the headlines. Many people are talking about it, even more so than usual, and that is the restriction. The priesthood restriction, as well as the temple restriction, from about 1852 to 1978 within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, Tarik, for those who may not know too much about the priesthood restriction for whatever reason, could you tell us what it was and some of the common myths associated with it?
Okay, so two things. First of all, there's the priesthood ban for men of African descent. So up until 1852, when President Young made his announcement before the Utah legislature that men of African descent should be denied the priesthood, up until that time, there had been restrictions of any kind as far as priesthood. We have several Black men that we know for sure were ordained. The most famous, of course, would be Elijah Abel, but also Walker Lewis, Black Pete, and a few others. And so up until that time, there was no restriction. In 1852, President Young says that Black men should be denied the priesthood, and also that both Black men and Black women cannot receive their temple endowment or receive the sealing ordinance, although Blacks were still allowed to do baptisms for the dead, so they weren't fully cut out from the temple, but they weren't allowed to receive those ordinances. And that continued from 1852 up until 1978, when President Kimball received a revelation in the Salt Lake Temple that the time to end that policy had come. And ever since then, Black men have been able to be ordained to the priesthood, and Black men and Black women have been able to receive their temple ordinances. What's the difficulty is trying to, well, there are a few questions. One was that policy inspired? Did God direct it? And do we have any evidence of that? That's one question. Why did it take so long, over 100 years, before that policy was rescinded? And of course, now what do we do going forward with racism in the United States and in the church? So that's the background.
Well, and hopefully we can cover all those important topics throughout this episode. So you mentioned how it was introduced and put into practice about 1852. So would it be fair to say that there's no good evidence that Joseph Smith actually taught any semblance of a priesthood or temple restriction of?
I'll go a bit stronger. There is no evidence that Joseph Smith taught this. We know that he was aware of the ordination of Elijah Abel, whom not only he but his father were both good friends with. We know that Walker Lewis was ordained to the priesthood. And in fact, one of the reasons we know that is because President Young said that Walker Lewis was one of the best elders when he was addressing another Black man who was going up for excommunication, saying that, in fact, it has nothing to do with blood, that God's made us all of one blood. And so whatever's happening has nothing to do with race, because after all, one of the best elders is a Black man. So all the evidence suggests that up until 1852, there's no problem. And certainly not from Joseph Smith, who by the standards of his time was pretty progressive on the racial issue. He did, as Richard Bushman notes in his book, Rough Stone Rolling, he was uncomfortable with interracial marriage, although he didn't say it was a sin. He did say that he would prefer it not happen. But for his time, that's pretty good.
So it would be fair to say, although he would have had some prejudice against people of African American descent or who were Black, he was not to excuse that. Like, he wasn't as bad as like a number of other people of his contemporaries. And he, of course, what's rather pertinent to this discussion is there's no good. In fact, there's zilch evidence really that he expected or even taught a priesthood, let alone a temple restriction on people of African descent.
That's correct.
Okay. So what do you think, like, some people want it to go back to Joseph Smith, or believe it to go back to Joseph Smith?
Well, those who have read Answers to Gospel Question, President Joseph Fielding Smith, or Doctrines of Salvation, both of which are still, I believe, available at Deseret Book and sold by them. President Smith, who, of course, would have known all the presidents of the church except Brigham Young. He was born right before Brigham Young passed, so he was alive, but you wouldn't have known him. He said that the band went back to Joseph Smith. So another prophet has essentially said this is why it happened. Also, there was a proclamation, not exactly a proclamation, but President George Albert Smith and David O. McKay and J. Reuben Clark signed a letter that said that the priesthood ban went back to Joseph Smith and it was inspired. So all the church teaching up to that point had been that, because through gaps of time, people started to think, well, where did this ban start? And then they started getting the idea it went back to Joseph Smith. The problem with that is that after Brigham Young died, Jane Manning James, she came to the Quorum of the 12 and petitioned for her endowment. She was a friend of Joseph Smith. And when the 12 were thinking about her receiving her endowment, they were looking through, well, where did this policy come from? So the 12 at that time weren't exactly sure when this had started. As you know, some of the 12 were closer to Joseph Smith, some were a little further away at that time. So their reasoning to keep the status quo was, well, assume since President Young instituted this policy, he had good reason to do so, even though we don't have any evidence. That was their reasoning. Even though at the time, Joseph F. Smith, who had been a counselor in the first presidency, had said, no, Joseph didn't teach this, and we have the records of Elijah Abel being ordained and Joseph Smith knowing about it. So it's a bit it's a bit clunky. I guess people would like to say if something like this happened, then it had to be inspired. Joseph and Brigham Young acting under the same source of inspiration would have gotten the same information. So I think that's where it comes from, the combined effort of, we get a lot of our history and church curriculum to filter through the ideas taught by President Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie, his son-in-law. That's what they had thought. That's what generations had thought, and it keeps being passed down. Most Latter-day Saints, as you know, do not read a lot of what I would call history, professional historians. They're not going to be reading a lot of the things that come out of dialogue or the Mormon History Association. So that's where they get their information.
So, like the movie Fiddler on the Roof, the belief is largely due to tradition in many respects.
There you go. Perfect. I love that show, by the way. It's one of my favorites.
I'm just glad I kind of got to reference it in an episode.
You know, tradition isn't a bad thing. But you can't, the problem is you can't just blindly auction. You need to always ask, well, usually a tradition comes about because it helps our lives work better. But many traditions exclude people or hurt people. So we should always be willing to question tradition, even though we don't need to necessarily expunge tradition.
Okay. So you mentioned how Brigham introduced it in 1852. So a two-pronged question. Is there any hints that people were expecting or thinking of a priesthood restriction prior to 1852? Was that ever debated prior to that point? And also, how exactly did Brigham implement it in 1852?
Well, it's as Paul Reeve talks about in his book, Religion of a Different Color, it's a little fuzzy, all the details. And actually, for our listeners, Paul Reeve is actually working on a series of documents where he's going to put all the documentation on this into one volume. So look out for that in the near future. But it looks as though, from what we know, that Brigham Young is reacting against certain interracial marriages that are going on around, and he's very against the mixing of blood. And then he is also influenced, knowingly or unknowingly, by the Protestant culture of his time, as when he introduces the ban, he uses the idea of Cain being cursed and Canaan's seed being reduced to slaves, and that's kind of his justification. So, which was a common justification for slavery, but then Brigham Young puts a twist on it and said, no, what it's referring to, there's a ban on priesthood. So that's how he gets his idea, as far as we can tell.
And how did he exactly implement it in 1852?
It's interesting. So remember that Brigham Young in 1852 is not just president of the church, he's also governor of the Utah Territory. So there isn't as much separation between church and state as there would normally be in states. And as he's addressing the legislature, he brings up the issue of Black people, and it's a pretty harsh letter. So not letter, but address, where he not only goes on about priesthood restriction, but he talks about, I'd rather give donkeys the right to vote rather than blacks. It's pretty rough, but yeah, that's kind of, and he also says, if no prophet, I'll say it now. So in essence, what he's saying, no one else has taught this up to now, but now as the prophet, I'm saying this is what's going to be the way it is going forward. So he doesn't cite any revelation. He just uses his authority as president of the church to pronounce this is how it's going to be.
Yeah, reading the language of that address to the legislature in 1852, it's, at least to me and seemingly to you and many others as well, clearly Brigham's saying this is a novelty, I'm introducing it based on my own authority. He doesn't appeal to like revelation like to Joseph or even to himself. It's more like this is the authority being endowed to me So on this kind of level, I'm going to introduce it. How would it be fair to say that this particular address to the legislature?
One
Oh,
other
go ahead.
small note. So he may have been, and Paul Reeve addresses this in the new book that's coming out. There's a letter that Orson Pratt wrote where he said there's no evidence. This is before the 1852 address, that people are descendants of Cain or Canaan. He said there's just no evidence of that, talking about some other issue. So it's possible that Brigham Young, as we know, Brigham Young and Orson Pratt hated each other. So it's possible that Brigham is responding to Orson there, saying, okay, well, Orson may think this, but this is what the prophet has said. So there's that in there as well.
Yeah, I'm currently doing a research project for work on Adam God, so like the whole Orson Brigham debate always comes up. But with respect to like what I was asking before you added that very helpful
Yes.
note, um, as you mentioned, like Latter-day Saints, for better or worse, and I would say worse, tend not to read like scholarly books or go back to the documents as much as they should. Would it be fair to say that the 1852 legislature is not like being well known until like recent years, and thus the ignorance about this? Because at least to me, reading this, and I reread it recently as well, it does kind of seem to like be very strong evidence against any idea Joseph had any priesthood restriction in these teachings, and it seems to be something that comes about only in the 1850s. Would that be fair to say?
We knew about the 1852 address for a long time, but probably not until Paul Reeve and a few others have really started making it more well known. Has it been more in general discourse since then? I knew about that address before I joined the church, so it was out there, but it wasn't talked about very much. I mean, this issue I feel has been talked about more in the last 5 to let's say 10 years, previous 100 plus put together. So the information has been available, but as we the issue wasn't addressed very much after the ban, and then after the ban was rescinded, people kind of just moved on. It's gotten more. There's been more interest in recent years. So,
Okay.
but certainly the 1852 makes, combined with the other evidence of Joseph Smith knowing about the ordination of others as well as Brigham Young, it makes it seem very difficult, if not impossible, to trace this band to Joseph Smith. And with the 1852 statement, it makes it very hard to say that this is a result of divine inspiration, as well as President Young doesn't cite it. And as we know, if there's one thing we know about Latter-day Saints, is that they document everything. So if there had been a revelation, someone would have written it down, like Brigham Young received, or President Young told us that he received this revelation. And at no time does President Young ever say, I received this revelation. It was always through my authority as the prophet, and also relying upon common Protestant traditions, and then switching them over to priesthood.
Thanks for that. So, could you give us briefly, I know it's a tall order, but like a very brief history of the ban from 1852 to 1978? Like, were there attempts like to rescind it within the church by faithful members? And also, how exactly did it
Well, as I
come
mentioned,
about with respect to it being rescinded in 1978?
okay, well, let's try to condense 100 years into about 5 minutes. So, as I mentioned, Jane Manning James appealed for her endowment, and the 12 denied her. We do know that a grandson, I believe, of Elijah Abel was ordained an elder, even though he was of African American descent, obviously. But for the most part, remember that there aren't a lot of Black people in the church, and for many years, the church is just a Great Basin church, and there aren't a lot of Black people there. So it's not really in church consciousness for most of that time. It really starts to come more during the Civil Rights era in the 1950s. But before that, President McKay, when he was a counselor in the first, no, he was a member of the 12 at the time. So 1921, he was visiting Hawaii, I believe it was, and and a couple to get married. The husband was African American, the wife was not, so they couldn't be sealed. And President McKay had been an apostle for 15 years at this point, and when he heard that, he didn't even know that there was a policy. So if President McKay didn't know, you can imagine most people for a long time didn't know, because again, wasn't mentioned very much, not a lot of Black people around, so just not something that people are thinking about much. President McKay, after becoming church president, when he went to South Africa, there had been a policy in place that even for white people, unless you could show that all your ancestry went through Europe, you couldn't be ordained to the priesthood. He changed that on the spot and said, look, unless you can show definitively that this person has African blood, then we're going to assume that they don't. So he made that maneuver there. And he set up a committee of a few apostles and others to study the origins of the ban. And he did want to rescind it, but he felt because it had been going on for so long, it needed a revelation to change. So I'm not sure if McKay ever understood that the ban wasn't instituted by revelation in the first place. That was just an assumption of his because it had been going on for so long. So he felt that he needed a revelation to change it. So he did not change it, although he did want to, it seems, from all the evidence we know from President McKay's life. Lester Bush, I think in 1972, wrote a book, an essay and dialogue called Mormonism's Negro Doctrine, I believe is the name of the essay. And he goes through all the evidence up to that time. There's no evidence that Joseph Smith instituted this policy. And then President Kimball had Elder McConkie and a few others research the issue. And they came back to him saying, yeah, there's no evidence Joseph Smith taught this. And there's also no scriptural evidence that says that this can't be overturned. And President Kimball spent a number of years praying and trying to seek the Lord's will on the matter. And then he received the revelation on June 1st, and then the ended there. And then on June 8th, that's when the word got out that the ban had been changed. But so from Brigham Young to David O. McKay, no evidence of anyone trying to overturn the ban. And the consensus of the time would be, this is instituted by God. It can only be changed if revealed. And then President McKay gets the ball rolling by questioning the ban itself, and then, but not feeling he could change it without a revelation. And then President Kimball eventually doing that. There was also, it should be noted, certain apostles did not want that ban to change. So, such as President Harold B. Lee, as noted by Greg Prince in his book, David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, he was pretty adamant that Black people would not get the priesthood his time, and that proved to be correct. There being that we were a Great Basin church, which was in a predominantly white area, there's a lot of racism that's permeating in the area unchecked. And so given that white people of that time were not comfortable integrating with Black people, they were perfectly fine keeping that policy where it was. Now, it wasn't everyone, there were exceptions, but that was the general rule.
Well, thank you for that. I knew it was a bit of a tall order to give condense 126 years of history into like 5 minutes, but you did a very good job, so thanks for that. So, now, speaking personally, the priesthood restriction and the temple restriction, because it wasn't simply a priesthood restriction, is like, at least for me, like a very difficult topic. You know, it's something I had to wrestle with before I joined the church. I abhor racism. You know, even in Ireland, you know, where like it's almost predominantly white, you know, maybe it's because like we were oppressed for like 600 years by other white people. We kind of understand the plight of certain people, so we just hate racism as it is. It's probably why like the joke is like the Irish are the blacks of Europe, if you've ever seen the movie The Pretenders. But joking aside, it is a difficult topic, and we're both involved in some way or another with apologetics, and I think it would be fair to say like we're pretty well read on various topics. So um, I'm going to like ask like some questions, and I'd like to see how you would respond to them because as I said, this is a hot button topic. So the first question would be, was it actually racist? And if so, if it was a racist policy, should we be able to say, like, say, Brigham Young et al. Were in some way racists? And if so, how does this affect or not affect the true claims of the church? Because that's a common one to hear. Like, Brigham and the church leaders were racists, the church is a racist institution, with the and the ipso facto there being, well, the church can't be what it claims to be. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Right. Okay, so just making sure I got all the questions. So the first question was the policy racist?
Yeah, was it racist? And if so, does that mean that the church leaders and those who implemented it were racists? And if so, how does this lead the church? Is it a racist institution itself?
Well, given that the ban was based upon not revelation, given all the evidence, but racist assumptions, you would have to say that the ban itself was racist, yes. Were all the church leaders who supported the ban, were they all racist? Well, certainly I would say that President Young was. I would say, and the other thing is, but the other thing I would also say that basically everyone at that time was racist, so that's not much of a surprise. I guess and of course, racism, depending on how you define it, you can define it as something that's personal, meaning my personal attitudes about other people. There's also institutional racism, which is like how society is structured so that certain people will benefit and other people will not. So need to make sure we make that distinction. Yes, I would say, and of course, with everyone else, it would be to varying degrees. Orson Pratt, I would say, would be less racist than President Young. I'm comparing them since they're contemporaries. If you look at people like President McKay, who would be the person who really pushes the ball, gets the ball rolling. It's interesting how he opposed civil rights on one hand, but he was very open to that priesthood restriction ending. So his relation to that is very complicated. So you'd have to go on a case by case basis. But certainly, I do think the ban was racist, and that defending the ban is racist now. So as far as whether that affects the truth claims of the church, well, no, because the truth claims of the church have to do with, did the first vision happen? Is the Book of Mormon a historical record? Did Jesus rise again from the dead? Those are the fundamentals of our faith, and those have nothing to do with this policy. This is a second order question. After you've answered those questions in the affirmative, then this becomes an interesting issue. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, the first vision didn't happen, then the priesthood ban is simply an interesting anthropological issue if you're studying Mormons, but it has no real significance.
Okay, thanks for that. Another thing that comes up is, what did it last so long? It lasted 126 years. We're not talking about like an isolated event, that lasted like a week or two, and that the church quashed. So I usually, some people who actually think it was based on revelation in some way or another, without necessarily agreeing with the racist assumptions of many people, claim, well, of course it had to be revealed, because why would it last so long? And also, if it was a mistake, which I believe it to be, and you believe it to be, why would God allow it to last so long? Is this not like going against, to use a technical term, the indefectibility of the church in this dispensation? And if it is a problem, how far can the ticket be pushed, if you will, in terms of what mistakes globally the church can make before it can actually fall into apostasy?
Okay, why did the ban last so long? Well, like we can't fully know why. One reason I think that has some pull is that God will only answer questions if we bring them before him. It doesn't, and also once the once Brigham Young instituted the policy, remember, there aren't a lot of black men. And if President McKay had been an apostle for 15 years and didn't even know there was a policy, most people probably didn't really know about it. So that's one reason. There were other things going on with the church at the time. If you read through our history, you have Wilford Woodruff having to figure out, how do we balance polygamy with also trying to become a state, and also try to have not everyone being arrested. Then Joseph F. Smith trying to bridge the polygamous church to the non-polygamous church, then going on through other types of affairs. So it just wasn't in the forefront for a long time until the civil rights era, where we really began to think about the origins of this thing. That's one reason. The other thing is, and this is, again, this is my opinion, pure speculation, but I think that the president of the church, as well as the brethren as a whole, needed semi-comfortable, not just with extending the priesthood and temple ordinances to people of African descent, but they also needed to be okay with integration. They needed to be okay with Black people really just being a part of their community. I'm not sure that people up until 1978 were fully ready for that. So that's why that's another reason.
Okay.
I think in large part, that's why President, who had, we'll talk about book recommendations, but if you read his book, Lengthen Your Stride, which was written by his son, you'll notice that President Kimball had being from Arizona, having more interactions probably with African Americans, he had considerably less prejudice than others who had been just in Utah. For example, when right after the ban was lifted, a Black woman came to him and asked him if interracial marriage, no, there's no sin in it. There's nothing wrong with it, as long as he said there can be complications with, the racist culture, but there's nothing wrong. And this is something he had repeated when he was a state president. So that was long before 1978. So, yeah.
Now, on that, some may say, well, the church is promised not to fall into apostasy, so why would God, and we kind of answered like some reasons why God would have allowed, not that he wanted, the ban to take place for 126 years. But do you think this might affect the church's claims to indefectibility in this dispensation? Because we're promised in the scriptures that the church, unlike other previous dispensations, will not fall away. So how far can the church stray, do you think?
Well, I take that to mean that the authority of the priesthood will not be taken from the earth. I take that to mean that our knowledge of the true concept of God, our relationship to him, those things will stay. That doesn't mean that the church can't make serious errors. So if we look through the Doctrine and Covenants, it's full of Joe Smith making lots of serious errors. And so I guess what the problem is we put leaders on a pedestal, whether knowingly or unknowingly. We think that they're far different from us, and that they can't make mistakes, even though we know through our interactions with maybe bishops, stake presidents, and others, that these people make mistakes. Even though we sustain them, we sometimes put general authorities, especially presidents of the church, on such a high level that we just think they can make minor errors, but they never make a fundamental mistake. And there's no reason to believe that. In fact, if you read, of course, we're reading the Old Testament, it's full of prophets making lots of serious errors. Notice that in the scriptures, you run scriptural Mormonism, you know the scriptures better than what I know. I think the only person God says, I love you to in the scriptures is David. And David is called a man after God's own heart, yet he's also an adulterer and a murderer and things like that. So the fact is that no matter how who you are, you can make fundamental mistakes. And that's, and we do ourselves a disservice if we think that just because a person attains an office in the church or is called of God. I certainly believe that Brigham Young was called of God and his successors. But I still think this was a fundamental mistake.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that if one does not put church leaders onto this artificial pedestal, one they don't often claim for themselves, the scriptures don't claim for them, it doesn't necessarily mean it takes away like a lot of the problems, but it does help with the resolution to certain problems in church history, like this or Adam God or some of the other hot button topics. Yeah. And I know it's a bit irreverent, but your comments about scriptures and people being sinful reminds me of the Simpsons. And shout out to your mutual friend Steven Smoot if he watches this. He's a huge fan of the Simpsons as well. It's when Homer got a Bible, like $20 for this book, and everyone's a sinner except this guy.
Yeah. Or no, one of my favorites in the Simpsons movie, when he opens up the Bible and runs through it, says this book doesn't have any answers. It's a lot of the Simpsons, but
yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in anyway. Okay, well, thanks for
we're getting off topic.
So far,
going back.
I know, but it's all good. So far, so good. So, unfortunately, like even well-meaning members of the church who are errant but well-meaning, they sometimes come up with apologetics or defenses of the restriction. Now, let me just say, just because someone might think the restriction is inspired or was inspired doesn't mean they necessarily agree with the racist assumptions held by many church leaders. I actually know a few people, including here in Ireland, who still think it was inspired, although they struggle to justify it, but they instantly reject it. I reject racism. They may have read into it. So we don't want to give the impression just because you might think it was inspired or you still struggle with that question, you're racist. But unfortunately, some of the defenses given are either really bad, really lousy, or just plain damn offensive, especially if you are an African American. So let me just ask you, like, maybe like say 2 or 3 common apologetic tropes one finds, and get your quick responses there too. Or if you want to go long, go ahead. The first, and it unfortunately is rather, I'm going to bring this up because it's has contemporary currency, is, well, it's all good and fine, to complain about blacks not getting the priesthood until 1978, but the whites couldn't get it until 1829. Why do you think that is? I want to say stupid on the face, so let's just say just a really dumb apologetic. And
well, first of all, we know why other races didn't get the priesthood until 1829, and that's because the priesthood wasn't on the earth to be given. So it's not the same thing. That's comparing apples and oranges. The other problem is we also know that black people or black men were ordained to the priesthood up until 1852. So you're already asking the wrong question. The question you should be asking is why was this policy implemented from 1852, not changed until 1978? Why is there no evidence that it was instituted by inspiration rather than by racist causes? And was the policy the right thing to do? That should be asked. I want to circle back a little bit to something you said just a moment ago. You said that there are people who reject the racist assumptions, but they still think the band was inspired. I think you're probably thinking about people such as President Oaks, who said at the B1 conference, "I've never agreed with the reasonings given for the ban, but that's because God doesn't give reasons for what he does," which is also not a good answer, because oftentimes we know exactly give certain commandments. He'll usually explain why that commandment is given, such as if you read through the 10 commandments, after each one, God will say, this is why you're doing this. This is why you're doing that. The word of wisdom is so you can have treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures. Why build a temple? Because I can reveal myself to you there. Why do you need the priesthood? Because my house is a house of order. So it seems that God's pattern is actually, I do tell you why, or I'll tell you eventually. So I just water. it's just the real fundamental reason I think for those people is we just don't want to accept that a president of the church could be racist and wrong for this long. That would really hurt our faith or our view of presence of the church. And it
No,
really
I
should.
would agree that's a driving assumption. Even
And
with
I
most
and
of
I
those who are
and I don't think it needs to do that. I'll use an example here.
please.
As you know, uh, there's no philosopher I love more than David Hume. And Hume has actually come under recent controversy because there was a footnote in one of his essays where he says that there's no evidence that Black people have ever run a civilized nation, or that they've ever been civilized before white people enslaved them and made them better people. And also, he said in another letter, he said that Black people are always just looking for liquor. He said they would sell he actually says, quote, a Black man would sell his entire family for a keg of brandy. That's all it would take. So, I love and revere David Hume. That's very, very racist, both of those assumptions. But you need to remember, well, why are these people admired in the first place? Those things don't go away just because a person has a prejudice that's common to their time. It's in fact that makes them still the more admirable because in spite of their flaws, they still do great things. You and I know a lot about Joseph Smith. I'm sure no one knows more about Joseph Smith than Richard Bushman. He knows flaws and all. He doesn't try to hide them. Joseph Smith is a prophet and still admires him. In the case of President Young, I know a lot of things about him. I still think he was a great prophet, great man, and I still would have sustained him as a member of the church during that time, even though I would have disagreed with the policy.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Another one, and this sometimes they use this as scriptural evidence for the concept of a restriction, not necessarily de-restriction from 52 to 78, would be, well, in the Old Testament, only the Levites, held the priesthood. So, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to think God would be okay with the blacks not getting the priesthood for a certain number of decades in this dispensation. Now, unfortunately, this is also rather common, but it also seems pretty fallacious, don't you think? And if so, why?
Well, it's true that the tribe of Levi were the people who were running the temple and doing temple rituals, but all Israelites were still welcome to come into the temple and participate to an extent. So that would make the parallels kind of disanalogous. Also, just because God restricted the priesthood to that area, he also called prophets and kings from other tribes. So it wasn't that the tribe of Levi had any type of favoritism. It was just kind of an assignment that they had. But more importantly, that wasn't exactly the original plan. As we know, God wanted to dwell with the people. And then they said, no, Moses, you do that. You tell us what God says. We don't want to do that. And then God organizes the priesthood that way. So the original plan is God dwelling among his people that are rejecting him, and then that becoming the way it goes. But again, we have all the details of that, and we see we see why that happened. Versus in the priesthood ban, the assumption is there's a revelation that institutes it, and we don't have any evidence of that. So the basic problem is there's just no evidence of the ban being implemented by inspiration. That's just an assumption people hold. But if you challenge the assumption, that's where the evidence will be lacking.
Thank you for that. Now, I would want to move on to something a bit different, but it's still connected to it, and that's the issue of it's all good to know about this history and other topics as well. But when it comes to, say, the nitty gritty days, the pastoral issues, what should we do? For instance, if missionaries come across either a black member of the church who found out about the restriction and he's struggling with it, or they come across a black family who want to join the church, but, they struggle with this, thinking it may be racist. And what do you think, speaking to yourself as a black convert to the church, how this should be approached when it comes to both the investigator as well as the member who struggles with it?
On the member side, the most important thing they can do is make sure that they're aware of the history, the justifications, and everything that goes into that, so that they're not giving an investigator a false image of what happened. Also, but after that, they need to just come clean and say, yes, this is what happened. This shouldn't have happened. We're moving past that. We're working to make sure that we know what happened, so this kind of thing doesn't happen again. But the important thing to remember, as we talked about, I think about 20 minutes ago, is the reason that you joined the church is because the first vision happened, because of the resurrection, because we have the keys of the priesthood, and those types of things. Those things can still be true even if the policy was not inspired. So what it will mean to a prospective member is that you're going to have to, is that you can't, there's a common trope in the church like, well, when the leaders have spoken, the thinking has been done. No, you don't have any right to stop thinking as a member of the church. You need to keep thinking, keep questioning, but also keep your faith in what you know to be true. So that's what I would do. The best antidote is just telling people the truth, because eventually we're going to have to do that anyway. So just be upfront about it, and we'll save ourselves a lot of trouble.
Kevin Burney, who's actually a well-respected LDS scholar and apologist, often said, "Sunshine's the best disinfectant," and it's better if you come clean on a difficult issue in a faithful setting than than people finding out from, say, the pages of Mormonism shatter reality. So I think there's something to that. It's better you just bite the bullet, admit it, and say, "This is the worldview. I'm not trying to justify it, but this is the worldview they came from, and this is how it came about." But as you know, they should focus first of all on first tier issues, and if they do have a spiritual conviction of, say, Joseph as a prophet, the first vision, they can still join the church and still be faithful, even if they do justifiably struggle at times with the topic. I think everyone, regardless of their ethnicity, who knows about the history, does often struggle about it and often wonder about it.
So sunshine is the best disinfectant. I thought that was Mr. Clean.
He should sue.
I guess I get if sunshine is the best disinfectant, I guess instead of praying to Mr. Clean, I will now pray to the sun. So good to know.
This is going to be taken out of context by some Des Natters. Okay, that's the pastoral issues, but one of the other topics that often comes up is should the church apologize for the restriction? And so let me ask, do you think the church should apologize? And if
no,
so,
that's
I'm sorry, and if so, how should that apology look like?
This is something I've thought about since I joined the church, and my views on it have evolved. So I think that you can only apologize for something if you've personally done it, saying I'm sorry that I did X. So the person who would have to apologize would have to be President Young, and he's not available to do that just yet. I'm sure he'll do that in the future. So no, I don't think the church should apologize in that sense. I do think an admission of error would be the correct way to go, but I think that I leave that up to the brethren to decide what to do. That's their call to make. So, and also, but it's complicated because there is a balance here of if we say this, do we want to rock people's faith in everything? And there's a large generation of people that you would affect if you were. So that's something they'll have to weigh. That's something they'll have to decide. But I do think until the only way to fully put this behind us and put it on the path of true healing will have to be that a blatant admission that this shouldn't have happened.
Okay.
Whether you call that an apology or not, I don't know.
Sure. Now, as we come to the close, let's deal with one or two other issues as well that's related to this topic. Some people claim, well, if you believe the restriction could be and was indeed a mistake, what about the gay issue? Well, the church at this moment rejects homosexual marriages and does not engage in gay sealings. Sometimes we'll claim, well, the restriction on, say, gay marriage and gay sealings is the same as the restriction on the priesthood and temple. And I'm sure you've heard that before. So do you think that's a common? Do you think that's a correct parallel? And if not, why do you think it's fallacious to draw that kind of parallel?
Well, certainly there are members of the LGBTQ community that are similar to racist prejudices against African Americans and other minorities. In that sense, that's comparable. As far as having sealings of the same-sex couples and comparing that to the priesthood ban, that wouldn't be analogous because the church has never done that. Versus we know that the church did ordain Black men to the priesthood. So that would be that. And also the other thing is the church's policy and beliefs about same-sex marriage are basically the same as the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church. In Christianity, marriage is seen as between a man and a woman, or in certain cases, as you know, between a man and multiple women, hopefully with all of their consent. We're not going to get all into the polygamy issue now. You'll have to talk to Brian Hales and others about that. But that's not a comparison that works in my mind.
Yeah, because the restriction, say, homosexual behavior actually does have scriptural warrant, but the restriction on the temple and priesthood for blacks doesn't. And for those who want a good book on the gay issue, Robert Gagnon's book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, is probably the best on the market. So, Tarik, before one other thing would be, what books or articles would you recommend for those who may want to delve more into this complex historical and doctrinal issue?
I think everyone should start with Lester Bush's essay and dialogue, Mormonism's Negro Doctrine is the name of it. It's excellent, even holds up well even today. Paul Reed's book, Religion of a Different Color, has 3 chapters on this issue in it, so it's very good. Russell Stevenson's book, For the Cause of Righteousness, I believe is the name of it. That's another very good book. Max Muller's book, Race and the Making of the Mormon People, which Muller is a non-Latter-day Saint, but he has a very good summary of it there. David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, Chapter 4, Black Civil Rights and the Priesthood by Greg Prince is a very good book. So that chapter would be the very important one. And Lengthen Your Stride by Edward Kimball has several chapters on President Kimball's praying about the issue, his evolution on it, and how he dealt with it after the ban was lifted. So that's very good. Also, in a moment of privacy, so I was good friends with Joseph Fielding McConkie, who was a son of Bruce R. McConkie, who was an apostle. And I actually, when I was on my mission, I wrote him a letter and I said, you know, I know how much you loved your father, I know how much you admired him. And he said, and I asked him, you know, how did you reconcile, you know, your father being the great man that he was with his vigorous defense of the ban? And he wrote back to me. He said, you know, that my father was, he said he was a man of his time. He said he did have racial prejudices. He said, but towards the end of his life, he did recant those, and he noticed a change at the end of Elder McConkie's life on that issue. So that was very touching to me, that people do repent and recognize the error of their ways. And Elder McConkie, in his talk that he gave at BYU, I forget the name of it off the top of my head, where he says, look, forget everything I've said about this issue. We have more understanding on it now. So people, I think, I just share that for people to know that let people repent, let people change. Don't forget, and this is something else that helps me with this. Don't forget that if you were in that time and space, you probably felt the same way. We feel a lot differently about racism now than we did in the 1850s, but that's because we don't live in that time and we're looking through the rearview mirror at it. But don't forget, in 100 years, there's going to be something that we're prejudiced about that people will remember us for. So don't forget that the Christian ethic, and by definition, the Latter-day Saint ethic, is to forgive, even though we can call out the error, but realize there's more to people than just one issue, and people can change. So I wanted to end with that. I just thought about that.
Well,
I
thank
say
you.
that because Joseph was a very good friend of mine, and I really miss him. So,
Yeah, and one of my closest friends here in Ireland actually served under him in Scotland, so I've heard very good things about him as well.
oh yeah, I mean, one of the few mission presidents who was a mission president of the same mission which he served. So I don't know how many times that's happened.
I'm sure it's a pretty rare occurrence. But no, I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that. So before we go, is there any projects you're working on, or anything else you want people to know about what you're doing? Or because I believe you're participating in a dialogue or a discussion
Um,
in the next few weeks with an atheist on YouTube.
let's see. I'm working on a paper on Mormonism and free will. We're finishing up another paper on Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, working on a paper on scientism and pragmatism. So I have a few things. So I'm working on a biography of Blake Ostler. So I'm reading everything he ever wrote. And here's another lesson for people. You don't always have to agree with anything anyone says to recognize the person's still brilliant. It's amazing how much Blake has written on, and you know, in writing kind of these chapters on each of his thought, it's like I feel like I'm leaving so much out because you can only focus on so much in a short biography. So
I look forward to reading that. You're smart, and Blakey's like crazy smart, so it should be a very interesting book. I actually do have great respect for both you guys. So, Tarik, I do appreciate you coming on today, all the way in Texas, and hopefully we can have you on again to discuss your proposed solution to the mind-body problem, as well as perhaps discuss Mormonism and Christianity, which is where we actually originally first crossed paths, I believe.
yeah, we should probably do that one next, and then probably one on Latter-day Saints and free will, since I'm working on that. But I mean, I guess we can do that with the mind body problem. I think it's related.
No, no, that would be great fun. We should definitely set it up. But until then, Tarik, again, thanks for coming on. And for those who watch this episode, hopefully this will be an important resource and stepping stone into like studying this important, even if controversial and difficult topic. So until then, God bless.